Known as the DC-3, the Dakota or the Goonie Bird, this aging but ageless aeroplane transformed the passenger aviation industry in the 1930s.
The aircraft in those days was really equivalent to the Concorde today. The Concorde is at least 20 years ahead of its time, and so was the DC-3.
When we came up with the DC-2 and the DC-3, it was the first time, I think, that we'd ever used wind tunnel data to design the airplane.
El DC-3 se puede comparar con un tractor. Yo pienso que es irreemplazable. Y de pronto el avión que pueda reemplazarlo es el mismo DC-3 con turbina.
It wasn't a war machine at all, except, of course, it did an enormous job during the war. It just about did everything that it could possibly do. It was the real workhorse of the skies.
Now nearly 60 years old, there are some 1,500 Dakotas still flying worldwide. In Britain, the Air Atlantique fleet stands prepared and ready for work.
Well, our particular operation is quite unique because we operate up to 10 Dakota aircraft at any one particular time. I think the main characteristic for using the Dakota in our operations is the fact that they are relatively cheap to buy. We use these aircraft for carrying anything from nuts and bolts through to livestock, to parcels, and even to newspapers. It doesn't take very long to convert one of these aircraft from its freight carrying role into the passenger configuration, perhaps 3 to 4 hours at the very, very most. And we can install seats, and when the aircraft is in the passenger role, it looks very, very modern inside. We want to work an aircraft as much as possible because that means much less downtime in terms of engineering and maintenance. If an aircraft is used more, it tends to be more reliable.
Global trade has grown up around the Dakota.
I bought about 20 of them from all over the world. We've got them from the Danish Air Force, from the Spanish Air Force, operators in the Caribbean. Some of them can be neglected and sitting around on airfields for years, and others can be fresh out of service, especially the military ones, which are as good as new. This airplane has never been civilianized, and it's always been kept in its military configuration. It came over to this country during the war. It's been on the Arnhem run. It actually towed gliders over to Arnhem. It's got the cut-off tail area still on with the glider towing hook goes, and the aircraft survived the war. It also went on the Berlin airlift. Inside the aircraft, it has all its wartime fittings, and it could be worth $200,000. There are very few of them left in passenger service these days, but there's a great following for them in South American places like that. There's a tremendous amount still in operational use.
La selva colombiana es inmenso el número de personas que viven trabajando allí, ¿sí? Y así como es de grande el número, también están solicitando, están pidiendo, ¿sí? Y el único medio de transporte, ¿sí?, es aéreo, ¿sí? Y preferentemente por cuestiones económicas, ¿sí?
Colombians reckon that they went from the mule to the aeroplane in just one move. The vast and dense jungle interior is still without decent roads. Journeys that can take 4 or 5 days by car are only a couple of hours away in the DC-3. The history of these aeroplanes is closely tied to the development of passenger aviation. They taught the public to fly and helped the airlines to grow. Before the Dakota, government mail subsidies kept the airlines solvent. Passenger travel operated at a loss, since planes could only carry 6 to 8 cramped people.
Those airplanes were very noisy, and it was impossible to carry on a conversation in the cabin, and passengers usually had to wrap themselves in blankets to keep warm, and It was really considered you were very daring to fly on an airline in those days. The public had very little confidence, and people used to make out their wills for flight just to go on a passenger flight from one place to the other.
The Dakota was designed by Donald Douglas, who had a small manufacturing company in Santa Monica, California. In 1932, Jack Fry of Trans World Airlines put out a tender for a new airplane to compete with the rival Boeings. One of the conditions was a three-motor design.
When Douglas engineers analyzed the requirements for this specification, they concluded that they could do the job with a two-engine airplane. So they came up with what was then called the DC-3.
It had a stressed aluminium skin design which was light and immensely strong, but the 710 horsepower engines were thought to be insufficiently powerful. A special test was imposed by Trans World. The prototype DC-3 had to fly over the Rocky Mountains with one engine turned off and still have enough power to fly the plane safely. It succeeded.
When we got an order from TWA to build the DC-3, we extended the length of the fuselage slightly and changed the passenger capability from 12 to 14. And we increased the power and we increased the speed, and so it was basically the same aerodynamic airplane, but it had a little longer fuselage.
The production model was called the DC-2. Trans World ordered 25 immediately, a huge order in those days. The plane broke long-distance records and proved safe and reliable. It was in demand by airline companies worldwide.
Good ship, lollipop, it's a sweet trip to a candy shop where bonbons play on the sunny beach of Peppermint Bay.
By 1935, new radio navigation aids made night flying possible, so a wider-bodied sleeper version of the DC-2 was developed for American Airlines. The night berths needed more space, and this was exploited on daytime flights in a new version, the DC-3.
When we built the fuselage to accommodate the sleeper bars, then we could have put a whole extra row of seats. So instead of 2 abreast seating, we had 3 abreast seating. So instead of 14 passengers, now we had 21 passenger capability. The operating cost of the DC-3 was not much greater than that of the DC-2. We had a little more horsepower and burned a little more fuel, but we had really increased the payload capabilities so much that now the airlines could operate this airline on passenger load alone and make a profit.
The DC-3 made passenger flight commercially viable for the first time. It became the most glamorous, successful and popular plane in civil aviation history. By 1939, the DC-3 was carrying virtually all world airline traffic, and the passengers loved it. It was a dream image that the Douglas factory could barely keep up with.
The procedures used in manufacturing the tooling was very limited at that time, and a lot of the work on assembling the part was done by the mechanics. We had expert mechanics in the shop at that time, and so even the drawings didn't cover what the part should look like, and the man in the shop would say, well, the drawing says this has to be modified this, and he had a little black book, and when he'd build the part, where the drawing wouldn't cover the situation, he'd look in his black book to know how to produce the part.
A larger plane could make bigger profits, but the ambitions of the Douglas factory and the airlines were overtaken by events. With the coming of war, the United States Army Air Corps commissioned a heavy-duty version of the DC-3 and called it the C-47. At peak production, 50 planes were made a week at factories in Santa Monica, Long Beach and Oklahoma City. Over 10,000 C-47s were built in all, mostly by a new and inexperienced workforce. Rosie the Riveter was the propaganda title bestowed on the heroines of the production line.
I was a Rosie the Riveter, one of the earliest ones. I worked on the C-47, and my first job was to put on these nut plates on these 4 gas tank covers.
We used a lot of housewives and shoe salesmen and drug clerks to build the airplane. So we had to design tooling that they couldn't make a mistake.